Hi, I'm Leanpub from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Mark Graban. Based in Cincinnati, Mark is an internationally recognized consultant, author, professional speaker, blogger, and host of the podcast My Favorite Mistake. You can follow him on Twitter or X at Mark Graban and check out his website at markgraban.com. Mark is the author of the book, The Mistakes That Make Us, Cultivating a Culture of Learning and Innovation. In the book, Mark explains why we should embrace and learn from mistakes instead of punishing people for them, thereby fostering a productive culture of learning and innovation in our teams and organizations. In this interview, we're going to talk about what Mark's been up to since he was last on the podcast, setting up a podcast of his own. And at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his book and his experience publishing it for his company and the sort of various routes he's taken to writing it and getting it in front of people. So thank you very much, Mark, for being on the Leanpub Front Matter podcast again.
Yeah, Len, thank you. It's great to be back. Good to talk to you again. So thank you. Yeah.
Thanks. As regular listeners know, I always like to start these interviews by asking people about their origin story, but you've done that already. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about what you've been up to since you were last on the podcast, which was like 5 years ago. So it's almost a new origin story, I suppose.
It's an update. Yeah. Thanks for not making me rehash all. No. The origin story is the same. Yeah. But when we talk about maybe the origin of the mistakes that make us, and it's funny you mentioned Twitter. I spend far less time on Twitter than I did 5 years ago. I'm pretty active. LinkedIn has become, in a lot of ways, a mostly professional social media, kind of platform. So people can find me there as well if they like. But over the past 5 years, I'd been promoting the previous book that I'd published initially through Leanpub, a book called Measures of Success. Book marketing is always more of a marathon than a sprint, or at least, I'm trying to do a lot of things. It's not like, the book's done. We did 2 weeks of marketing. Now I'm back to writing another one. Like there's things that come from a book, speaking and teaching and coaching and what have you. Coming into March of 2020, I've done most of my coaching and consulting work has been very healthcare focused since 2005. March 2020, was traveling almost every week to go to a health system in North Carolina. We probably knew a little earlier than the general public that, hey, this new virus is out there and they're not quite sure. Like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm just going to come here and, we'll see in a couple of months, I think was the thought at the time. I ended up being, and again, I'm blessed, I'm fortunate, I have nothing to complain about, but the reality was, it was 2 years of not traveling for healthcare clients. So I put my time and focus into a number of things, like doing marketing work for a consulting firm that I was working with as a subcontractor at the time. And then you start thinking like, well, what can I do, stay engaged, learn something new, create something new. I've been podcasting since 2006, actually. It's kind of a podcast called Lean Blog Interviews. It's kind of it's not the best name ever, but it was an extension of my blog. Mm-hmm. And, you get to a point where, you've been podcasting long enough, you end up on these lists and people start pitching guests to you. And because that podcast is so niche focused on lean healthcare, lean manufacturing, lean startup, lean publishing, as we've talked about, when you've been on that podcast, I was often having to say, no, thanks. It's not a fit to potential guests. And, summer of 2020, I got pitched an opportunity to interview Kevin Harrington, who was one of the sharks from season 1 of Shark Tank in the US version. And it really got me thinking, like, let me find, I think this is kind of an entrepreneurial thing, but like, let me figure out how to say yes instead of just saying no. He's not a fit. And so that turned into a new podcast, an additional podcast called My Favorite Mistake. And Kevin was the first guest. He came on and I think very vulnerably and authentically shared a story of a big mistake that almost put his company out of business at one point. But he set such a good example for the guests, to follow. He took ownership of what he did, but he made sure he learned from it. And he made adjustments aimed toward not repeating the mistakes. So those are the things that we celebrate on the podcast, and having guests from all kinds of different industries, I started seeing patterns. And after a year and a half, I started thinking about it maybe earlier, but after about a year and a half, it's okay. There's a lot of great stories here. I think there's a book to be chiseled out of all of this clay and marble of these stories. So that's kind of what got me started down the path. We were moving from my wife's career, so she took a job based in Cincinnati as somebody who's helping drive a lean culture and a lean transformation in a manufacturing company. So that's kind of the dinner table conversation we have sometimes, overlap in our professional lives. But so new podcast very much led to opportunity here for the new book, The Mistakes That Make Us.
Yeah, thanks very much for sharing all that. It's interesting. One thing that happened since you were last on here is the podcast became a little bit of a time capsule of sort of people's experience of the pandemic, because I added a sort of new segment where it's like, how's the pandemic been affecting you? And a lot of Leanpub authors or people who publish books on Leanpub through their organizations and things like that are very independent people often, and they're people who many of them do a lot of consulting and a lot of flying around and like in-person talking to people. And so there were, a lot of people who were like, very, everyone was very robust, but they were, what's my year is going to look very differently now from what I thought it was going to look like. And I don't know what the end of this is going to be. And so it's sort of, there's a sort of interesting level where it's like, oh, I'm a consultant who teaches people how to deal with change. And, now I better, to sort of put the rubber on the road, as it were, in my own, life and work, and, how I'm going to work and help organizations themselves through, this very big change that everyone was going through. And I know particularly in healthcare, for obvious reasons, it was just this extraordinary time of transformation and innovation. A friend of mine who's a surgeon in Edmonton, Alberta, talked about like how, like what you've been reading in the news about like 10 years of advance in 10 months is very true.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And, I stayed connected with some organizations virtually, remotely. It's interesting. I think it goes to show it could be a fine line between continuous improvement and innovation. And you can use lean mindsets and principles and problem solving methodologies on both sides. So there, more often than not in healthcare, people are trying to improve an existing process, to reinvent a process. The pandemic created the need to create altogether new processes, drive-through testing clinics or in parking garages, really establishing from scratch brand new processes to meet brand new needs. And then as things have evolved, mass vaccination opportunities, whether that was, at a hospital, or I did get to go and visit, it was a private public partnership between Toyota and the city of Frisco, north of Dallas, which is, next town up from Toyota North American headquarters. The best mass vaccination clinic that I saw, designed and then continuously improved and refined using Toyota production system and lean principles. So a lot of organizations, if you will, leaned into it. And then there were some organizations, sadly, that said, well, we're in cost-cutting mode. And they were laying off people that would normally do process improvement or process design work. So it was kind of this mixed bag of how resilient or, what the approach different health systems took. I don't know if it's 50-50. I don't have data, but I know there were some that, doubled down on the lean methodology, and some said, no, we can't afford that right now, which my bias, I think, is clear. I wanted everyone to double down and share what they were doing to innovate and improve so that everyone could have the best mass vaccination clinic.
Speaking of sharing, on your podcast, you ask people for their sort of favorite mistake, as it were. Have you ever talked about your own?
Yeah. I've gotten that. I do get the tables turned.
Right.
Usually not my own podcast, but now as I've been out promoting the book. I can answer that two ways. And, a favorite mistake is, like in the case of Kevin Harrington, that was, I think, also maybe his biggest mistake. But I'm not asking what's your biggest mistake, because that might just create stories of regret and sadness, where like a favorite mistake, it's subjective of why is it your favorite? It's usually one that's big enough that you remember it, and it led to some positive outcome, even if that positive outcome was not repeating the mistake. So, two answers I usually give. One, a little bit more flippant, but I mean it. Like when I took a job at Dell Computer in 1999, coming out of grad school, I learned probably within about 6 months, like, this is not where I want to be really long term. Like, I was doing interesting work with great people, but I was just like, no, it's just, it doesn't feel like a fit. And, I ended up leaving after about 2 years. They said, well, was that a mistake to take that job? Maybe it wasn't a huge mistake, but the positive and the thing that makes it a favorite is I met my wife because I had that job in Austin, Texas, and we have our 22nd anniversary coming up here. So to be clear, but if my wife, she might call me some days her favorite mistake. I'm not trying to imply the other. But then, like from a work standpoint, I think back even kind of within the first decade of my career, I look back and I think, well, I'd like to think I knew better at the time, but I didn't. It's a story around engaging a group of people in change and in improvement. And I was working at a manufacturing company at the post Dell, and some of it was the culture, where it was not an environment where, like Toyota, or a place where they really fully engaged the frontline employees. It was this catch-22. Like, part of the problem I was being asked to solve with Lean was being behind schedule on production, not being able to make deliveries to customers. But then, like, well, if we're going to fix this, I knew from past experience, I want and need time with the frontline employees, but the prevailing culture is like, well, you can't shut down production. Remember, we're behind. Like, well, how are we ever going to get out of that? And so, I did my best to try to engage people here and there when I could, develop some solutions to that problem that were, quite frankly, never embraced, never fully adopted. It got me certified through their Lean training program, which is kind of silly. So my mistake, I think, was not pushing harder, not putting my foot down, not drawing. I didn't feel confident enough at the time to draw a line and say, this isn't going to work if you're expecting me to give them solutions. And so, part of my adjustment, now that I work as a consultant, is not accept clients that want to put me in that position. I don't need to relive all of that. And I would feel more confident today trying to say what you're proposing is not workable, or is probably not going to be sustainable. I've been able to work with organizations since where it's a partnership, we're co-creating, people, value and own what they've had a hand in creating. I think there's, an important change management lesson there.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. That's a really good story. I particularly like the one about how this sort of, took the mistaken job, but had a huge positive life change by meeting your wife there, which is great. And that distinction between favorite and biggest is also really good, and very subtle thing too about sort of like in getting people to show up on the podcast and be in the right mood. When they're talking about their story. I was thinking a little bit before we started recording about, and when I was researching for this episode, about my own, and I actually couldn't really come up with a favorite one, but my own kind of biggest one is, I think, somewhat similar to the reason it's the biggest mistake is somewhat similar to what you were saying, where I was still relatively junior, and I was working in mergers and acquisitions for a big investment bank, and we were doing what ended up being a multi-billion-dollar transaction process to attempting to buy a utility in a country in Europe. And I remember being early on and I was like, we are going to come up with the best bid. We're the best team in this space in Europe. Basically we're going to get everything down to the fifth decimal place. We're going to research every avenue. We're going to be the best when it comes to M&A. But this is a political thing that we're doing. It was in the run up to a presidential election, and I was like, it's going to be political. Let's assume we can do the things we can do. And I remember the sort of team, the sort of leader of the team said, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. And I was like, I didn't say the whole fucking thing's a bridge.
Yeah.
This whole thing is that bridge. We're on it already. And I didn't say it. And I basically predicted exactly what was going to happen. And it exactly happened. So I know this mistake sounds like a humble brag, but it was actually like the fact that it worked out the way I thought exactly it would be just compounds the gravity of the mistake, which was, again, I didn't think I would be listened to. I didn't think, I didn't want to kind of like, it wouldn't be right to say I didn't want to make my boss look bad, because it wasn't that kind of culture. Like, nobody would have thought that kind of thing. But I just didn't want to mess with he had a vision for how he wanted to do things, and I just didn't want to mess with that too much.
Yeah.
And anyway, and I didn't want to like sort of be perceived as though I was actively kind of like objecting to what was going on or something like that. And again, it was because that would disrupt the team's performance. That's why I didn't want to do it. It wasn't out of reputation or anything like that. But I should have figured out a way to get this message across in a convincing way and say, hey, like, it's all political. We have to we have to have something, people on that. So that was my biggest one.
Well, but yeah, I mean, so it sounds like that fits a lot of the rough criteria of a favorite mistake, right? Like, that story, I can tell, has stuck with you, and you've reflected on it and you've thought about it. What was your role? What was the role of others? And, all you can take ownership is what you did or didn't do. And think about, well, how did you grow? What would you do differently? But, to think back to elements of that. One thing I write about in The Mistakes That Make Us is, about some things that I've learned about why would people choose to not speak up about a mistake in the workplace. Let's say they've decided they want to, like, personally, I can handle it. I can admit a mistake. Why would they not do so? It usually comes down to two things, and we can kind of think through or just leave it of how, to think about what impact these two factors had in your storyline. But it's either a fear factor or a futility factor. Right. So I think the fear factor comes to mind of like, well, I can't speak up and challenge the boss. I'll get in trouble. Or in a lot of workplaces, people will say, I'm not afraid to speak up. It's just not worth the effort. I point out these problems and nothing happens. I speak up with improvement ideas, and no, it's not that I don't care. It's just not worth it. In fact, they care so much, they get discouraged, and they just say, well, fine. I'm not going to set myself up for that disappointment of suggesting something and not be heard or not have it be followed up on.
You did me two great podcast host gifts there. One was you did the segue to the next part of the interview where we talk about your book, and you also spontaneously asked me the first question I was going to ask you, which was why wouldn't people speak up in the first place about mistakes? And the sort of futility and fear, that sort of very well, I think, captures a lot of people's experience with that kind of thing. So I guess the next question I would have is, if there's let's say an organization that has a fear culture where, like, if something goes wrong, the first thing that happens is you find someone to blame and punish them, whether it's humiliation or suspension or even, firing or what have you. How do you help, if let's say you're brought in as a consultant and there's a sort of board that's like, we don't want to have this culture anymore. What would you do if you were brought in with that mission?
Yeah. And that first step is necessary, or like you said, I wouldn't be there. If someone didn't recognize this needs to change, whether it's a new leader comes in and kind of diagnoses the situation of what they've inherited. I mean, you can come in and, in a lot of cases, you can use an anonymous survey vehicle, because there's an irony where, or it's just a crappy situation where people don't feel safe talking about how unsafe it is to speak up. So you could try to do surveys, and but even then, like, sometimes people like, I don't believe that this is really anonymous. Like, that starts going around. That's a different layer of fear. You can try to survey people and try to quantify, to what degree. Like, psychological safety is not a yes/no binary thing. It's a matter of degree. How safe? do you feel speaking up in certain situations? And you can do surveys, you can ask some open-ended questions. The survey that I'm trained on and licensed to use, ask open-ended questions like, what's one barrier that prevents you from speaking up about mistakes or different categories of things people might speak up about? And I remember one of the free-form responses just said point blank, it doesn't really seem safe to say. Like they very directly called out the lack of psychological safety to even talk about the lack of psychological safety. So, you can try to do, a little bit of, surveying or assessment. Leaders need to do a lot more than just say, okay, it's safe now. Like that just doesn't work. Even if there's a new leader, people don't know that leader. They've been conditioned or trained to protect themselves by keeping quiet. So I think, thankfully, though, there are some things that leaders can do that are effective. And it's really more action-oriented, right? So you can encourage people to speak up. But what matters more is the action. So, I cite and credit Tim Clark, who I did some formal psychological safety training through his book. It's called The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety for anyone who wants a deeper dive into this. But 2 really practical takeaways from Tim Clark's research and experience, and I've seen this play out. Leaders need to first off model these behaviors that they want to see. Leaders start by admitting mistakes, saying very directly, I made a mistake, I was wrong. Better yet, kind of being, an experimental problem solver, which I think is such a core part of the lean methodology. When a leader says things like, I've got an idea, but I could be wrong, or maybe it's not perfectly correct. So let's test the idea first, make sure we're not making assumptions. And like all of these kind of lean startup-y thought processes can apply to organizations that are decidedly not startups. Like leaders need to lead the way of saying, I don't know, and saying these things that might be considered vulnerable or risky. When the leader sets that example and then maybe verbally encourages people to do the same, what matters is when somebody tests the waters and say, okay, well, the boss is all about admitting mistakes and saying you were wrong. Well, I'm going to try and see how that works. The leader had better reward people for doing that. So it's really 2 things, modeling and rewarding, not tolerating, but rewarding. It's like a stronger action word. And like if someone admits a mistake, we can acknowledge the negative impact of the mistake, but instead of focusing on blame and punishment, we can focus on learning and improvement and preventing that mistake or similar ones from reoccurring. And there's just the punishment. The only thing punishment does is really just drive mistakes and problems deeper underground. And instead of teaching people to be more creative in how to cover up problems, let's try to help solve them and let's try to improve.
Yeah, that's really good. I know that one of the things you talk about is like, what I'm not saying is, oh, that's fine. Forget about
right.
it. If someone admits to or sort of surfaces a mistake that they made.
We're not saying, oh, who cares? We're not being flippant or but yeah, we can take these things really damn seriously. And in healthcare, many mistakes can be harmful or fatal.
Yes.
But punishment doesn't change what happened. Punishment, I think, needs to be reserved for intentional acts. And by definition, mistakes are unintentional.
Yes. And an interesting thing that one thing I've thought about with respect to this kind of thing is that punishment, and which of course really results in going underground or hiding, a culture of hiding mistakes or trying to put the blame, put the responsibility for the mistake on someone else. That culture is completely orthogonal to whatever the mission is for the team or the organization. It might help in some way, it might not, but the primary culture becomes one of deviant deception and illusion. And that's what people are primarily concerned about, which is another way of saying what they're primarily concerned about is themselves rather than the mission that you're on. If you can't say, I did something that was detrimental to our mission, then the only reason you're doing that is because your mission is for yourself primarily, not for what the organization is really set up to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wouldn't I don't hear you faulting people for that. I wouldn't fault people for that. No. You know, I think of situations, again, a lot of this is, I can't help but frame it around healthcare, where, the situations, and there's a story in the book of a similar situation of, let's say, somebody who's lower in the professional hierarchy or pecking orders. You're in an operating room or in a hospital setting, and the nurse thinks or knows the surgeon or doctor is about to make a mistake. Right. There are a lot of times where I've heard, lectures or admonitions to those nurses of like, well, you should speak up. I'm like, well, it'd be great if they felt safe doing so. Or even like this layer of guilt trip of like, well, it's your professional obligation. I'm like, well, okay. Likewise, I would say it's the professional obligation of those surgeons or leaders to create an environment where that kind of safety can exist. So I don't think it's helpful to blame individuals for not speaking up, because I always think of like, okay, that nurse should speak up. Okay, and that nurse may get fired for challenging the surgeon, and that nurse is a 40-something single mother, and like, really, that person should put their paycheck and maybe their home on the line. Like, get out of here. That's not fair. That's not realistic to put that on a nurse or a group of nurses. It comes down to culture, and it's not a matter of character of like, oh, good people speak up. I'm like, oh, come on, life's more complicated than that.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting example actually, because, for example, especially like things can, like seconds can matter in surgery, right? And like I say this not as a surgeon, but I know some, and know a little bit about it, and like it could be that you could, like, the complication of that situation, it's incredibly intense. There's a body open in front of you, and the surgeon might actually be innovating on the fly because they've just encountered a problem they've never seen before. And let's say a nurse or even another surgeon observing might be like, oh, they're about to make a mistake. And so if you bring it up, all of a sudden now that surgeon has to handle explaining to you and doing their thing on the fly. And so, and I just bring that up as an imaginary example where, like, it could be that, like, there's just a kind of higher level triage you have to do sometime, where it's like, well, what we'll do is we'll bring, and then what you want to have is practices in place that people know. So it could be that, like, afterwards you have a breakdown meeting and you say, hey, I thought you were making a mistake at this point. And then, the person can say, oh yeah, no, I wasn't. And, like, I don't know, you can come up with various code words if you've got, but again, I guess if you've got practices in place, if you've categorized certain types of problems, then person can sort of intervene and say, I think this is a B-type problem or something. Anyway, but it's that I just found that to be a very fascinating example because it's so complex what it means to kind of intervene in a real-time situation like that.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, there are different scenarios, different situations, but one thing I've seen in kind of getting deeper around feeling safe to speak up and then how we go about it. I've been able to sit in on some training that is really kind of based on a lot of aviation practices. And like there's a 4-step process, and it's easy enough to remember, basically say, let's say you're the surgeon. First off, say, Dr. Epp. So I'm addressing you respectfully. I'm getting your attention by using your name. Right. Now you might react and say, look, the patient is dying and I'm dealing with this. Like, I mean, well, okay, then you can debrief that later. So it's, Dr. And then let's say they didn't stop me to say, Dr. Epp, I have a concern. But I think that second step is really interesting because you're stating a fact. You're not saying, hey, Dr. Epp, I think you're fucking up here. You said you cursed first. So I can say in an operating room, we can have that. So you're saying, I have a concern. Now, the way of resolving that could be learning why, there's not really an issue, but saying I have a concern, you can't really say, no, you don't.
Right.
I have a concern. No, you don't. Well, that's bullshit. That doesn't go in. So it's like, Dr. App, I have a concern. Step 3, state the concern. Step 4, make a recommendation. Right. So then I might, one example I remember is like, Dr. App, I have a concern. We don't have enough units of blood on hand for this type of procedure. My recommendation is that we don't start yet. Then the surgeon might resolve it by saying, well, I thank you. Well, hopefully first saying, thank you for sharing your concern. Reward that speaking up. Thank you for speaking up. And then explain maybe like, oh, well, because of the patients, I'm making stuff up now. Because of the patient's weight or age or something, like we really don't need more than 3 units of blood. So that 3 units of blood is okay. Oh, all right. But still, like, there's no punishment for having that quote unquote unfounded concern. Now the nurse knows, right? And they're not being punished in a way that would prevent them from speaking up the next time when it is a really quote unquote valid concern. So I think, things like that really make a big difference.
That's a really great concrete example of like how those sort of communications can be structured. I mean, I really like particularly, the sort of like the form of address, is respectful from the beginning, identifying who you're speaking to in a respectful way. Yeah. Categorizing what you're about to say by saying, I have a concern. And I love that detail of like, you can't reply, no, you don't. That's really amazing. And it's something else you mentioned was, the sort of like, sometimes, it might be someone who's, single parent who's got mortgage payments coming up and stuff like that. And sort of their job is like, like they've got their own triage to do when all the decisions they're making. And that just reminds me of a kind of funny story that Peter, my co-founder, and I have from when we were traveling together once. And we went to a Trader Joe's and one of the things we were doing was buying some wine to take back to the hotel. And this was in the States, and we're from Canada, so we have British Columbia driver's licenses. And so my friend Peter, who is like, 6'3", 6'4", kind of, middle-aged guy, gets asked for his ID to buy some wine, and he's like already it's a little bit miffed at that, but he pulls it out, and the clerk wouldn't let him buy the alcohol because the date didn't say birthday. It just showed a date. And the guy kept repeating,
what else is it supposed to be?
Yeah, I know exactly. Well, that's what Peter said. And the guy kept repeating, it doesn't say birthday. It doesn't say birthday. It doesn't say birthday. And finally the manager came over and looked at it and was like, let him buy the liquor. But anyway, we now have a kind of in-house little saying of it doesn't say birthday. And we use it kind of like to sort of lighten the mood when something like that happens. But the thing is, like, I bet you that guy probably was like, he was probably like out on parole or something like that. And that if he lost that job, it was deadly serious to him that like he didn't do a single thing out of line.
Yeah.
Right. And it made me like, after getting over being kind of, annoyed or laughing at the situation, it's like that there was something really serious going on in that guy's life and he couldn't dare make a single mistake. And it's important, I think, like we take it to heart when we're sort of designing things, that sometimes when people like, if they're like someone at a company might buy a Leanpub book and then not handle it responsibly and then just go to some, assistant and say, I need an invoice with the company name on it. Right. Yeah. And then it's leanpub.com, go get me an invoice. And then it's like, that person might be really like, it sounds like a kind of minor detail, but that person might actually be really under the gun. And if it says receipt instead of invoice on the document that we give them, their boss might be like, I asked you for an invoice. This is a receipt. Yeah. And so like, and then that person says, oh no, and we need accounting needs it by tomorrow. And it's sort of funny, but like single words can actually be really important. And I think it's sort of very important to attend to when it comes to mistakes. Like, yeah, sure, that guy was making a mistake in a sense, but like, whoever designed the BC driver's license didn't take into account international travel and all those, and things like that. And just like that's sort of in-house example of like the sort of true, that really high stakes for the person in what might seem like a really low stakes issue.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I love that. And it's this question of like, okay, well, what is the root of the problem. I appreciate your empathy for that person in the situation they might have been in, because a lot of times we discover, I think, through problem solving in a workplace, or when you're a customer and you think, this company is doing something wrong, and it turns out the problem is not the thing. It's not the problem you thought it was.
Right. Yes.
That there's some underlying systemic factor that we're not aware of. And when we can try to draw that out, I think that's really helpful. And realizing, we all make mistakes. And so we kind of point to, the phrase human error. And so, well, we all make mistakes, but then I've had people kind of throw up their hands and say, well, there's always going to be human error. What do we do about that problem of giving the wrong medication to a patient? What are we going to do about it? I'm like, we need to answer that question. What are we going to do about it? Meaning, not who are we blaming? Are we going to somehow hire people who are never going to make a mistake? What are we going to do about it? And this is a Toyota lesson, is design systems and processes and communication and all of that protect humans from committing human error. We can't ask people to be superhuman and to be perfect, because guess what? We get tired, distracted, we're not feeling well. I mean, there are all kinds of systemic, there are all kinds of human factors that quite literally make it more likely that we're going to create, that we're going to make a mistake, as I make a mistake and trying to say the phrase, make a mistake.
Yeah, no, that's, and it's, and I just wanted to point out, one of the last sections in your book is iterate your way to success, which is all about, that's a never ending thing. It's never going to be over, but that doesn't mean you don't do anything about it.
And I've blogged about this before, like when it comes to software websites, or like the fact that we can iterate our way to success isn't an excuse to not try to design something good.
Right.
To begin with. It's not saying everyone makes mistakes and we're going to learn from them. It's not giving permission to people to quote unquote be sloppy, because people want to do good work. People don't want to make mistakes. There's a time, and I took pictures at an airport, and I blogged about it. And American Airlines had designed this new digital signage for the gates. Okay. Like, I'm a frequent traveler, and what I care about is what city, what flight number. And they had designed this new digital signage that was beautiful. There was a photo of the city or the place, but then kind of like what the iPhone was at that time, all of the text was that stylish, thin Helvetica font. And I'm like, I don't know what building that city's in. I don't know what that represents. It's beautiful, but not helpful. And they did eventually kind of iterate their way back to signs with big, bold text, that was more readable. But I'm just kind of curious, who shared a hypothesis that the first iteration of that new sign was going to be well received by the flying public? I mean, I kind of fault them, and maybe it's unfair for me to throw stones. So I'm like, man, y'all should have tested that idea better before going live with it. Now, again, they could iterate, but that took time.
That's a very good example of a problem I could talk about for a very long time. What that's sort of just to talk about for a minute or two, I think there was a great, tweet or blog post or something that I saw, which was contrasting, I think it might have been GM's kind of mission statement with Tesla's mission statement. And Tesla's mission statement was basically, we want to build the best car the best way. That was basically it. And GM's was, we want to provide the customer with a delightful experience. And it's that trend that's been happening in the design of things in big corporations. This thing is what people want is a delightful experience. And no, they want a sign. In this case, yeah, sure, if I go to a bar, I might want a delightful experience, or if I'm going to a restaurant. But a sign is there to show me where my gate is, and how to get there. Maybe not I don't want I don't want I don't want any experience at all, let alone a delightful or an unpleasant one. I just want information. It is interesting how that's not taking the user's actual sort of but it's not just neat. It's like, what is really going on here? Why are we really putting up this sign? And it's not to have a delightful experience. It's to give people what they need.
Yeah. Yeah. And so there's always this risk of like, what, in lean startup circles, MVP, minimum viable product. How many people are focused on the minimum more than the viable and useful? And I mean, there's this question with lean publishing. You publish that first chapter. Do you publish the first shitty draft that hasn't been copy edited yet? Maybe not, right? I mean, like how good does it need to be before you hit publish? Even though you realize, okay, yeah, I can iterate. Like there's a fine balance there. And as my book coach reminded me, even with my last book here, releasing an imperfect book is better for your business than waiting to release a perfect one. So I think I found the right balance of like not agonizing over perfection. And again, like I did not use the lean publishing model with this book. I released, here's the book, here's the completed book. And then I did find about 12 or 15 typos or bugs, if you will, that needed fixed, so I could iterate. I found one the other day, but, trying to find that balance of like how early to release. Like, the lean software, agile people say things like, well, if you're not a little bit embarrassed by your first release, you waited too long. But then like as an author, I'm like, does that same thing apply? I don't know. Maybe a book is more personal than software or a website. I don't know.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You've given me another great gift as a podcast guest, which is you segued into the third part of the interview where we talk about the author's approach to writing and publishing and things like that. And I'm super interested to hear about that because so for this latest book, some of your previous books, you've done sort of a lean publishing style thing where you publish in progress, but for this one, you sort of published it all at once. And it's super interesting that question about typos and like when should you release applies to all publishing, right? Like because it's in like everybody who's ever even like published a blog post knows that like the moment you hit publish, you see the typo in the title or whatever. And this is true of this has always been true of book publishing, and
even traditional book publishing. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, exactly. And like knowing where to stop and like there's an interesting. I'm sure you've heard I always forget which band it is, but there was a band that like whenever they were doing a concert, they had a list of things that needed to be done. And one of them was like, take all the red M&Ms out of the bowl of M&Ms.
So it was supposedly Van Halen.
Okay.
And I believe the story is true, whatever the color of the M&M was.
Yeah. And the idea there is that like, they weren't doing it because they hated whatever color of M&M it was. It was because if the people were setting up the concert, there might be pyrotechnics, huge things that could fall, things like that. If they didn't do that detail, because they didn't like it or they didn't think it needed to be done. Well, then what, because they were using their own judgment, it's like, well, without communicating that they hadn't done it and why, then they just didn't trust anything else that was done. And I think there's a lot of that going on. And like, it's kind of a subjective thing, but when people open up a book, if there's like a typo on the first page, you're like, well, you just lose confidence in what's going on. I think there's an element of that to it. So it's kind of a serious thing, right? Like it's not just these people don't pay attention to detail. It's like, do I really trust that they're an expert on X, Y, and Z if they you have a typo on their first page?
Yeah. But I think there's a lot of applications of this idea of I'm going to go look for the small detectable mistake,
right?
Because it would be harder or impossible to inspect if all the stage lighting and everything had been rigged up correctly. Mm-hmm. So you look for the thing that you can actually look for,
right,
and then say, okay, maybe we're going to use that small mistake as an indicator to really seriously go have a professional go inspect for the big potential mistake, even if that means canceling a show. Like I think the one time we'll probably never try this again. My wife and I were buying, we put money down to buy a house that was being built, right? So we were not building like our house, but it was basically in the neighborhood, like, here's the house on this lot and here's the plan. Would you like to buy it and then wait, for it to be built? So we're like, okay. And then we started, you go in and you walk through, whether it's with them or you just go stomping through on your own. And we started seeing all kinds of mistakes that were so obvious to us with the naked eye. Like, I probably wouldn't have feared that the whole thing was going to collapse. Like, that doesn't happen in the United States. I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but it certainly did shake our confidence in the home builder and in our frustration built, and their reaction to the frustration wasn't good. And we basically said, you know what, it'd be more expensive to see this through. It was expensive to walk away. But I mean, those things were kind of like our brown M&Ms or whatever the color was.
It's interesting, though. I'd never quite thought about it in the way the sort of like there's a caution that one should do if one's going to apply that kind of judgment, right? Because are you just looking for the things that you can see? And that reminds me of the sort of like, people who are sort of out of their I call them grammar scolds, people who are kind of out of their intellectual depth in a conversation, but will go, it's whom, not who, and it's kind of like, you're actually missing the bigger picture here, my friend, and language doesn't actually work like that, like people do things on the fly and what have you. So it's very important to think that, like, you might think you're doing the sort of like Van Halen life and death kind of thing, when actually you're just kind of being self-indulgent at the same time. So it's important to keep that in mind. And one thing I'm really interested in about, because we're sort of thinking through, I mean, 10 years maybe later than we should have, but like, book launching and stuff like that. How did you go about launching this book? I mean, and I'm particularly interested because it sort of came out of a podcast that you already had.
Yeah. I mean, I think with each book I've done, I've tried to be a little bit more methodical about building up to the launch. So one thing I'm always balancing is like, the impatience of like, back to releasing an imperfect book now versus waiting. It's like, well, and I talked through with the book coach, like, I could spend more time, like, the book's done, book is ready to hit publish, print, release on. I could spend more time on like trying to build this, PR campaign and build up or whatever. And then at some point she's like, well, the business benefit from getting the book out there, even with an imperfect launch, like, so trying to find this balance of like, there were activities, some of it might even be considered a plan around, different things I wanted and need to do to help promote the book. I certainly started doing, a lot of, teaser. And be some of the first who would want to go buy the book. I have no way of confirming if that assumption was true or not. Now, maybe then once the audio book was released, and then I, when I do podcasts, I can kind of insert, house ads, if you will. Like, hey, podcast listeners, the audiobook version is now available. Like, well, maybe people like, I'm not a reader, I'm a listener. And, so maybe it was a waste of time to promote the book when it was paper and readable ebook. I don't know, but, I try to do different things. I mean, you build a website for a book, lots of LinkedIn posts, book giveaway contests, kind of interviewed people who were involved in my book writing and production process and had them on My Favorite Mistake. And then, trying to be on as many other podcasts as a guest, to get word out there. I've heard it at one point when I haven't used a paid PR person for this launch, which I've done in the past, but one PR person was dead serious. So like, they probably had data to back this up. Like, you could hire a PR person to get you on TV. Like, that might seem cool. That might be, kind of a, not a vanity metric like Lean Startup Talk, but a vanity effort. And this PR person was like, radio listeners and podcast listeners, they're the ones who buy books. So I'm like, oh, okay. So I'm going to learn to focus energies there. So, it's kind of like this marathon book launch approach. Like, what are things I can do for free that are just a matter of effort? What are some things that are maybe a little bit creative? Starting to do some experiments. And I always try to frame everything as a small experiment, like trying to do some advertising for the book. And then the thing that I'm still trying to craft and figure out how to launch on LinkedIn is, like, I think advertising to sell one book at a time is probably not very worthwhile. But if I can frame an ad campaign around, hey, do you want to buy a bulk order for your team? Well, that might be a transaction that's more worth the cost of the view or the click, or something that more directly pitches, speaking or coaching or consulting. But the book in a way is marketing for all of those other things. Like the other thing I'll add, I'm sorry, I'm answering a question you didn't ask. Like, to me, the business model is not the book revenue and royalties, of which Leanpubs are generous, and thank you for that. Mm-hmm. It's not about the book royalties. The book is almost, I hope the book is of value to people, but the book hopefully opens the doors for, speaking, coaching, consulting, things like that.
Yeah, no, that's thanks very much for that really great answer. I mean, that's for a lot of people who are thinking like, should I write a book? And they're like, the first thing they think is, oh, how much money am I going to make from the book? Sometimes we get people getting really excited. They're like, I'm going to be publishing my book on Tuesday. I just wanted to let you know so your site doesn't go down. And it's we kind of hope you do that, but that's kind of very, very unlikely. And like, if one's going to be publishing a book for a company like you do, or self-publishing as an individual, thinking about like where it fits in your life and your professional career, and think what your real goals are, right? And like, it could be that getting some revenue from it is really important, but it could be that like if you, for example, if you have an accompanying podcast, people find the podcast through the book. They might not buy the book, but now you've got a new subscriber on your podcast, or vice versa, right? They might find the podcast and be like, oh, but like the book there's a whole book about this, and there's an audio book, and instead of listening to people kind of tell their stories, I can actually get the authors sort of everything they've learned from hearing all those stories in their book. So that's what I'm after. Things like that. And actually, speaking of royalties, so one thing I wanted to ask you about, and I know you blogged about this, is you tried having the ebook up on the Amazon Kindle Select program. This is something a lot of people who are into self-publishing have tried, or are getting into it. Like, sort of, it's one of the first things you'll probably learn about is that program. And what was your experience like with that?
So, the first books that I did initially through Leanpub, Practicing Lean and Measures of Success, I did the lean publishing approach and was working with Leanpub. And then you can also put it on Amazon. And again, like, I was outputting the Leanpub outputs, and was able to upload that to Amazon in addition to Leanpub. But then Amazon really wants you to be exclusive with the ebooks, not on the print, but on the ebooks. So I put those other books into that KDP Select program, which meant I had to take it down from Leanpub and like I retired it. Is that the right?
Yeah, that's right. We have a feature where you can retire a book, which means the landing page stays up, but it no longer can be purchased, and you can direct people to wherever else you're selling it now.
Yeah. And, my book coach I had asked her, and in her answer, should I do KDP Select? And she said, oh, absolutely. And like, I trusted her judgment. I'm not faulting her. Like, this was a couple years ago, and maybe some of the dynamics have changed and shifted for different reasons. But I started with the new book, The Mistakes That Make Us, as Amazon Kindle exclusive. And so in the KDP program, if people can still purchase the book at a price you set as the author. But then it's also available for people who are subscribers of the Kindle Unlimited service. That's what the reader side of it is called. It's like $11.99 a month, and you can borrow books, basically. You can download them. You can have up to X number of books. So I started looking at the royalties, and they'll break it out. Like, here's how much you're getting from ebook, from print book, from the Kindle Select program, and they pay you based on page reads, right? And there's this pool of money, and I think part of the dynamic maybe over time is there's more and more books published. The pool probably gets spread out, even though that pool of money kind of grows. I wasn't impressed with the payouts. On one website, I went and looked this up, and it said the rate in July was said to be roughly 0.4 cents per page. So we're like in the realm of micropayments, which were a trendy, hot idea for a while. So I went through and did the math based on the number of pages in my book. And so the royalty I would get if somebody bought the book, and I put that in finger quotes because you're really licensing it, you don't really own it, I was getting paid basically $5.50. At that rate, through the Kindle per page program, and they read the entire book, I was getting 84 cents. I'm like, that doesn't seem great. And I start looking at the absolute, it was like 2% of my Amazon overall royalties. And so after that 90-day period, I could pull it from Kindle Select. So still available for purchase, but not for borrowing. And then I was able to list the book, and I unretired Practicing Lean and Measures of Success. So those books are now available also on Leanpub and also some other ebook platforms. But like for me, and I've tried to do some reading and research, and a lot of people say, yeah, that pay per page read only works better for fiction writers. And if you've got a ton of books and you hook someone with the first one, and then they go plowing through your entire series, and there were more people saying, yeah, I don't know if it really makes sense as a nonfiction writer. Certainly, well, that comes back to the question of royalties. Like there's some people say, well, every time the book gets borrowed, it helps the algorithms at Amazon put the book in front of more people. So I'm framing it as an experiment. But I don't know. I don't know what I'd have to see to make me go back and try KDP Select again.
Yeah, thanks very much for sharing that. I really love it when people like share the details of it, like what their process was, what their experience was, how the thing works, and why they made their decision. That's just gold for anyone who's sort of thinking of doing it, or who's maybe had a similar experience and wondered what the explanation was. And definitely in the self-publishing world, for anyone listening, there are people who like, there's the path. The path is write 100,000 word novel a month.
Mm-hmm.
After 3 years, you'll have 3,600,000 word novels out there. Why are they 100,000 words? Well, it's a big number, but like it's a definite number. You can have like a daily number of words that you need to write. You can have a weekly target. And if you can do it, and like Amazon loves, one of the things that, speaking of algorithms, A, they change all the time, B, they're proprietary.
Yeah.
Right. And so gaming the algorithm is like you're already kind of subordinating yourself to some changeable process that other people are deciding on. And the people who are like making money from subscription services that are based on page reads like Kindle Unlimited, the people who are going to be making money are going to be the people who have 100 books out there and like 1 million pages or whatever to be read. I've always found that like it's just such a kind of like, it's sort of necessarily these subscription services turn into kind of Rube Goldberg machines, where it's like, oh, what's the 0.00859.21 cents per page read? And then like, there was a period of time and the people are always, whenever there's like a system, like even carbon credits or something like that, there are people who come to exploit the system. And so there were people who were like making books that had like a link from the beginning of the ebook to the end of the ebook. And that originally for a while was tricking the Amazon algorithm into thinking the whole book had been read. And then seriously, there are like office buildings with people who click to juice the sort of stats on things like that. And like, so if you're in a system like that, you're competing with people who are like exploiting the system professionally.
Exploiting. I mean, there's gaming the system, and then there's fraud, and some of that. If you're paying someone that's just click through, that seems fraudulent. You think, Amazon would have the data to look and to see how quickly were the pages being turned. They should have that.
Amazon definitely adapted to that thing, but the fundamental problem is inherent and doesn't go away, which is that you've got a system. That system has a structure, and that structure can be exploited. Once you've got a complex system of rules based on payouts and stuff like that, and like, there's and this is just very personal. This isn't me speaking for Leanpub or whatever, but the idea that like my system for paying independent authors or organizations only works if I can track everybody's page read. So now I have to have some proprietary system for reading the book that's getting all their page reads, and like as you say, like timing, maybe time of day, how long did it take them to go from page to page, like, oh my God, and then calculating some payout based on that. Like I've always found that to be, try it out. see how it works for you, but like treat it exactly as you say, like the first time you do it, treat it as an experiment, treat it as a reversible decision, things like that, like give it a try. But like I've always found those systems to be just kind of crazy.
Yeah. And then, there's other things to look at, one thing I love about Leanpub is the choose your own price model for the buyer, or the set boundaries around that. So correct me if I'm wrong. I think I have to be careful when I set that. I think Amazon's pretty insistent. We have to be the cheapest.
So that's my understanding of Amazon. If you're selling an ebook on Leanpub, we have no restrictions. They can do whatever you want anywhere else, whatever you want.
Yeah.
But Amazon and other platforms might actually, it's important to remember, if you've never done this before, that they might have their own rules. And Amazon, I think, says you can't sell the book for a lower price, the same book for a lower price anywhere else. And now, but the thing is, once you've got that rule, so what that means is that Amazon actually has like bots looking to see if authors are breaking this rule. And those bots sometimes catch people who are breaking the rule. Sometimes they're breaking the rule without knowing it. Sometimes there's a false positive. So you can, once you're in that ecosystem, you can actually suddenly, you put all this work into your book. You can maybe have all these contrivances of like, I'm going to have a sale every week to get it boosted on Friday at 6 p.m. because I know the algorithm likes that. And then one day you might go there and your book's gone. And it's like, oh my God, now you have to contact Amazon's KDP customer support. And that now you have to trust that they're going to be responsive. And all of a sudden you see your book doing that because it's not in any of the lists anymore because it's been taken off. And maybe you've been kicked off the platform, suspended from the platform too for violating. And it's because there was another book with a similar title with a different price. So like when you get involved in systems like that, now that being said, Amazon is where all the eyeballs are, right? So like, it might be worth it to get involved in all of that kind of stuff, depending on what your goals are, particularly with respect to revenue or growing your audience and things like that. But it's important when you get into those kinds of systems with rules like that to understand, that creates all kinds of vulnerabilities.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting to think through. I heard myself when I said the book royalties are not the main thing. So like if I was on Leanpub exclusively, to set that up where people could dial it all the way down to free, like I'm sure you look at data of like most readers probably wouldn't do that. And like, is there benefit to me and my overall business to have people willing to download it for free and reading it and maybe learning about me and the other things I do? Like maybe I'm making a mistake and not just at least making the option of it being free. What do you see when people have that option? And I realize I'm not the host here.
No. Please go ahead, Nat. I could talk about my stuff all day long. No, it's a very important decision because so as Mark's saying, Leanpub has a variable pricing model. So when you publish your book, you set two prices for it: a suggested price, which is what people will see it's set to when they go to the landing page, and then a minimum price. And we have these things called pricing sliders that they can slide to the left to bring the price down to your minimum price, or they can actually slide right to actually pay more than the suggested price if they want to. And because we pay an 80% royalty rate, we show two sliders, one that says like you pay and one that says author earns. And I think we're the only self-publishing site that like shows how much the author gets from your payment because the royalty rate is so high. And so what that means is that actually, this is like old Leanpub lore, but like basically we saw people choosing strange prices. And it's like, oh, it's because they were setting the slider to what they wanted the author to get. They didn't, because, so they would set it to like $10, but that would mean they'd be paying, whatever price, sort of, and $12 or whatever it is for the book. No, that's not right. That's not good math, but everyone knows what I mean. But what you can also do is so currently the lowest paid price you can set your minimum price to is $7.99, and that's another discussion. But you can also set it to free. And so one thing I would say is that some of our best-selling books for revenue, like how much money the author has earned, have a free minimum price. And whether that works or not. So, for example, And this is what this great distinction you made between like what the business of fiction and the business of nonfiction comes in. So one of the reasons these books, I'm thinking a very specific set of books, they sort of came out of a very popular MOOC on Coursera, a massively open online course. So the people who were coming to that page were professionals or people who were trying to advance students or professionals who were trying to advance their careers. And these are people who typically have like a budget for what they're doing. They might even be being paid by their company to do this and have a credit card or something like that. And so if a professional is buying you're a professional and they're a professional and they're buying your nonfiction book and it's got a free minimum price, they're actually more likely than in other circumstances to leave it at the suggested price, maybe move it down to the minimum price. But people will actually slide to the right and pay more if they think it's worth more than that.
I've seen that happen. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's because specifically, I think with Leanpub, it's some combination of the variable pricing, the fact that we empower the sort of customer to decide what they want to pay. People love that. The fact that we show what the author's going to earn has all kinds of psychological impacts on like whether you feel like you're being cheap or cheating the person or something like that. The idea that free is available, like sometimes people might reward you with a payment because you've been generous and made it free. And I would say also like some of our, it just totally depends on what and this is why it's so important to think, but what am I really up to here? Why am I really writing and self-publishing a book? So some of our most popular books right now are from, in terms of copies, are from a nonprofit based in San Francisco that's trying to give materials for teaching like kind of data science training to teachers all around the world, particularly from places where like people don't necessarily have a lot of money. And so they make enough money that it's like totally like helping to fund the nonprofit do what they're doing. But their primary interest is getting it to as many people as they can. So in their case, seeing like we sold 1,000 free copies today and we made $100 because some people decided to pay for it. Like they're perfectly fine with that ratio. So it depends, but it very much depends on the circumstance. But it's definitely the case that like making free minimum price doesn't mean you're not going to get any paid sales.
Right. Cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
Anyway, that's
thanks for going through that.
Yeah. No. In the interest of time, we've reached maybe our limit here. I just wanted to ask you the last question I always ask if the guest has published a book on Leanpub is if there's one thing that I guess for you after all these years still has you shaking your fist at Leanpub, damn you, why don't you fix this? Or if there was one feature, it can be anything that you would ask us to build for you, what would you ask us to do?
That's a really good question. I bet I had an answer the first time you asked me, but that was 5 years ago. And I know a lot of things have changed. I'm going to draw on a blank on what that might be this time. That was making me think like, okay, come on, be creative, come up with something cool that no other ebook platform is doing. I mean, and I've used a lot of the features, including, taking the ebook and exporting it as a print-ready PDF. I did that with the book Practicing Lean. Didn't do that with the others. I don't know.
That's okay. I mean,
I'm afraid you stumped me. I mean, and I started using the platform again more actively here. I'd have a better answer if I was starting another new project. Let me just plug real quick, because all the proceeds go to a nonprofit. That book, Practicing Lean, was something where I very intentionally wrote 2 chapters on this theme of like learning. It was my first exploration, I guess, of learning from mistakes and sharing stories. And then I recruited 15 other authors to write a chapter to share their stories. So I forget how long that took, but it might have taken like a year. So, that process was perfectly suited to lean publishing. That was my first use of it. So if I were to ever do a sequel of that, do a Practicing Lean 2, with more stories or something. I mean, I can think of a lot of situations where I would use lean publishing again, and I'd be able to give you a better answer.
Yeah.
And I'm not one who's shy to give feedback. I'm just kind of blanking out on how to answer that. So I'm filibustering and trying to see if I can come up with something. But
yeah, no, that's okay. It actually, when I spring that on people, that's actually kind of like, I would say almost like, half the time people are like, oh, I can't think of anything right now. But my answer to that is, if you ever do think of anything, you've got my email. Please reach out to me. Don't hesitate. Leanpub is what it is largely because of feedback from authors sort of like in the wild, trying things out and doing things and coming up with ideas.
Yeah, you guys have been super responsive, to those needs and questions over time. You're working with. It's going to sound like a pitch here. When you're working with Leanpub, you're working with people. Some big, huge, giant corporation. You may or may not be dealing with a bot. I don't know. Definitely. Are you going to get help or Yeah,
definitely. We try to do our best there. Well, Mark, thank you very much for being on the podcast again, and congratulations on the podcast and the book, The Mistakes That Make Us, Cultivating a Culture of Learning and Innovation. I encourage everyone who's interested in learning more about this to go buy the book. It's got lots of great stories and great advice.
Find it on Leanpub. Thanks, Len.
Thanks.